Hello, and welcome to this slidecast, which provides an introduction to the business of managing the ethics of education research projects. It goes hand in hand with the other materials on this ethics website. The idea is that having viewed it, you'll be able to see the principles it raises in action in the other materials. Okay, well, let's start then with the meaning of ethics. And before you go any further, you might want to stop and see if you can write down what you might see if you were to look up the word ethics in a dictionary. Pause now and do that, and then start playing the slidecast again. Well, I don't know if you did that task or what happened if you did, but when I looked up the word ethics in my concise Oxford dictionary, this is the definition that I got: the science of morals. Well, as the cartoon suggests, ethics can be thought of as a topic in its own right, the study of morals, if you like, but this isn't really very helpful to us. We need to think of something much more practically orientated towards supporting research. Our aim isn't to study morals per se, but to be able to take a principled moral stance in our own research projects. The second definition that my concise Oxford dictionary gave me was perhaps, on the surface at least, a little bit more promising. It offered the idea of moral principles or rules of conduct. Well, even without the humour, the dictionary definition alone actually says little about what to do in practice, and that's not really terribly helpful. To understand what I mean, look at two analogous examples. When I looked up the word war in my concise Oxford dictionary, it offered the definition state of hostility. Well, while war clearly is a state of hostility, the pictures remind us that the phrase itself says little about what it must feel like to experience war in practice. And the same can be said for love. The words warm affection capturing little of what it actually really feels like to share the sort of intimacy shown in the pictures here. So we can define ethics without really beginning to understand what it means to act ethically in practice. For educational research, ethics isn't something we just do at the start when we're planning. Rather, it should be a stance that we take towards our work that informs the whole way in which we act, and as you'll see in a moment, the quality of the data we collect, and hence the validity of the research itself. Well, having asked what ethics is, let's ask a potentially more useful question. Namely, what is ethics really about? I'm going to suggest at least 4 things here, and the first of these is the notion of acting appropriately as a member of society. There are a couple of points to note about the word society in this context. Firstly, that it points to the idea that research should ultimately be for some sort of social good, and we've got a responsibility to work with this in mind. Research certainly shouldn't be a selfish endeavour, particularly when you're undertaking it as part of a qualification, and where the need to gain the qualification can often be a powerful factor in your thinking. It also, though, points up a potential dilemma, whether social good might sometimes imply the right to carry out research that isn't in the immediate interest of a particular individual. In creating an ethics protocol in your research, you'll need to weigh up the relative advantages and disadvantages to those involved, and justify the latter really very carefully. The second point that I'd like to make is the notion that education research requires you to take a principled approach to your practice. This reminds us that we've got a duty to work within our own professional codes of conduct. Moreover, institutions such as schools, colleges and hospitals, etc., are prone to positioning us in power relationships, teacher over pupil, nurse or doctor over patient. And all these create potentially ethical dilemmas. And you're going to need to be thoroughly aware of this. In education research, it's common to follow the principles laid out by BERA, the British Education Research Association. And of course, you must also work within the University of Plymouth guidelines. Both of these can be found elsewhere on this website. The third issue to discuss in the business of ethics is the pragmatic issue of avoiding personal dilemmas. This is perhaps the most obvious thing, or I think at least the one that springs to mind most readily when we think about ethics and education research. Research readily places us in positions which can throw up tensions, particularly around responsibilities and confidentiality. Imagine perhaps interviewing a school teacher about his or her school and being told during the course of the interview that the head teacher was a bully. What would you do if the head teacher then asked you to tell him or her how the interview had gone? What would you do if the head teacher had insisted that you tell? Well, I hope it's obvious as well that because of the sensitive nature of the pupil relationships involved, one has to think very carefully how one will carry out research with youngsters in a way that avoid these personal dilemmas. Now, the final point I'll make about ethics is that ethics are fundamental to methodology too. This is a point that, in my experience, people tend to think less about, but I also think it's perhaps the most important one. Put simply, the ethical stance I take will affect directly the quality of the data I gain. Again, imagine me coming to interview you about your work or about the course you're on. I wonder what you would be willing to tell me. Well, I'm fairly sure that if I manage to convince you that I'm taking an ethically sound stance and that confidentiality and anonymity are all preserved, and all the other things one needs to think about have been clearly thought through, well then you'd be willing to tell me much more and in a more open and honest way than if you felt suspicious about my motives. The ethical stance and the clarity of it is therefore really important when you come to think about the methodology of any study that you're going to undertake. We hope then that in watching this presentation you've begun to understand the major message that we're trying to give, which is that ethics describes the stance one should take towards the project as a whole. Nevertheless, in practice at the start of the project you'll need to develop an ethics protocol, a description, if you like, of how ethics will be managed throughout the project. We usually try to think of at least 6 points in this respect. Firstly, informed consent ensures that everybody who's participating knows exactly what's going on and gives their consent to be involved. Honesty and openness are about the business of ensuring that everything that's done in the project is done in an open way and as honestly as possible. The right to withdraw describes exactly that. All participants have the right to withdraw, but more than that, they ought to feel that they can exercise this right as well. That's often difficult, particularly when working with youngsters or the vulnerable, whose power tends to be less than yours in whatever situation you're working in. Oh, and by the way, as well as withdrawing themselves, participants have the right to ask for the data about them to be withdrawn too. Clearly, people need to be protected from harm, both psychologically and physically, and you'll also need to consider confidentiality, which is not the same as anonymity. Anonymity is the business of not giving any names of people or locations, but confidentiality is a much more complex thing about who holds the rights to tell or to say or to describe what's happened in the research. And finally, you'll need to think about how you'll debrief your research. If you've been doing it as part of a course, you would probably be writing some sort of assignment, and this in a sense is a form of debriefing. But what about the people involved? Don't they have a right to know what happened? How are you going to tell them? In summary, it's often best to think about research as researching with people, not on them. We want them to be partners as much as possible, not victims that we're using for our own ends. We hope then that you found this presentation useful. In summary, we offer you the following grid. Across the top, social professional, pragmatic and methodological describe the 3 major aspects of any stance towards research from an ethical point of view. And down the left are the 6 key points for an ethics protocol, each of which might be considered in relation to the 3 aspects at the top. You might want to use a grid like this when you start to plan the ethical stance you're going to take in your project. You'll find a copy on the website. We wish you well, and we hope that these materials will be useful in getting you started.